Every war in recorded history had one undeniable truth: if humans fought, they won. But no one, not even the greatest minds of the galaxy, could explain why. The Gorvok Dominion had conquered thousands of worlds, crushed countless civilizations, and dismantled entire empires. Their warriors were stronger, their weapons deadlier, and their strategies perfected by artificial intelligence so advanced it could predict battles before they began. And yet, humans always found a way to win. High Commander Zalvok of the Gorvok Dominion stood in front of a holographic display, his yellow eyes scanning battle reports. Every time they fought humans, the same pattern emerged. Humans should have lost. Their armies were outnumbered, their fleets outgunned, their soldiers physically inferior. Yet, they never surrendered. They never accepted defeat. And somehow, impossibly, they turned every hopeless battle into victory. Beside him, Dr. Verith, the Dominion's most brilliant scientist, adjusted his translator device and spoke. "It is unnatural, Commander. Statistical models predict a 99.8% chance of defeat in most human conflicts." And yet, he hesitated, looking over the data. "They keep winning." Zalvok clenched his jaw. He had ruled for decades, leading countless successful campaigns. But the humans, they were different. Their war history read like myths, stories of weak, desperate people defying the impossible. He turned to Verith. "Find out why. If they have a hidden weapon, I want it exposed. If it's technology, we will steal it. If it's a genetic trait, we will replicate it. No species should be this lucky." Verith nodded. "I will need a human. Alive. A cold metal cell." The captured human sat in the interrogation room, his wrists bound by energy restraints. He was an average-looking man, lean, with dark hair, his uniform torn and blood-stained. But his eyes burned with something Verith couldn't understand. "State your name," Verith said, activating the recording system. The human smiled. "Captain David Holt." His voice was calm, almost amused. Verith folded his arms. "Tell me, Captain. How do your people win every war?" David tilted his head. "Is that what this is about?" He chuckled. "You think we have some kind of secret weapon?" Verith narrowed his gaze. "We know you do." David leaned forward. "Let me tell you something, document. Your kind, you rely on numbers, strategy, brute force. You think winning means destroying your enemies. But humans? We don't fight like that." His grin widened. "We fight for something bigger than ourselves." Verith frowned. "Explain." David shrugged. "You wouldn't get it." Verith pressed a button. The restraints tightened. "Then help me understand." David exhaled, unshaken. "All right," he said, locking eyes with the scientist. "But I promise you this, the answer will terrify you." Dr. Verith leaned closer, studying the human with a mixture of frustration and fascination. "You think I scare easily?" the scientist scoffed. "I've dissected the minds of countless species. I've studied civilizations far older than yours. There is no mystery we cannot unravel." Captain David Holt smirked. "Then let's see if you can solve this one." Verith activated the interrogation drone hovering in the corner of the room. It projected a hologram in front of them, hundreds of battle records, spanning thousands of years. Every single one ended the same way: humanity victorious. "These are your wars," Verith said. "Explain them." David glanced at the display. His expression remained unreadable. "What's there to explain?" Veritha's patience thinned. "Let's start with this one." He tapped a glowing red marker, and the hologram zoomed in on an ancient battle. The Siege of Thermopylae. A small force of human warriors held off an army 100 times their size, Verith stated. Logically impossible. They should have surrendered. David grinned. They knew they were going to die. They fought anyway. Vareth frowned. Why? There was no hope of survival. David shrugged. Didn't matter. What mattered was standing their ground. Vareth clenched his fists. Fine. Then explain the next one. He swiped through history, stopping at World War II. Your forces were bombed, your cities burned, your people starved. Yet, instead of breaking, you grew stronger. You turned every loss into a rallying cry. No other species behaves this way. David nodded. Yep. That's what makes us different. Vareth turned to another battle. The colonial revolutions. The resistance wars. The invasion of Earth. Each time, the humans should have been wiped out, but they weren't. Your kind refuses to break, Vareth muttered, more to himself than to David. Even when logic dictates surrender. Even when survival is impossible. David leaned forward. Now you're getting it. The scientist's mandibles clicked in frustration. He swiped again, this time pulling up the most recent battle between the Gorvok and humans. The Dominion had superior numbers. Their war machines were unmatched. Their battle strategies were flawless. And yet, humanity had turned an inevitable defeat into a counterattack. Vareth glared at David. What did you do? David chuckled. We adapted. The scientist scowled. Adapted? David leaned back, his confidence unshaken. You aliens don't get it, do you? You think war is about numbers, weapons, brute strength. He shook his head. Humans don't win because we're the strongest. We win because we're the most unpredictable. We're the ones who change the rules when things don't go our way. Vareth hesitated. There was truth in those words. The Dominion had studied thousands of civilizations. Most species followed predictable patterns. When outnumbered, they surrendered. When overpowered, they submitted. But humans didn't. Instead of breaking, they became more dangerous. Instead of fleeing, they dug in. Vareth stared at the glowing battle reports, his mind racing. No, that doesn't explain everything. David smirked. Then you'll have to keep looking. The scientist turned to High Commander Zalvok, who had been silently watching the interrogation from the observation deck. The commander's expression was unreadable, but Vareth could tell he was disturbed. I want more data, Zalvok said. The human is hiding something. Vareth hesitated. Commander, I don't think. Zalvok raised a hand. Capture another human. Put them in our war simulations. If they refuse to reveal their secret, we will force it out of them. David raised an eyebrow. Oh, this'll be fun. Vareth sighed, but he knew there was no arguing. The Dominion needed answers. Soon, they would learn the truth. But deep down, Vareth had a growing suspicion. They wouldn't like what they found. The cold metal walls of the interrogation chamber hummed with an eerie silence. Captain David Holt remained seated, his hands bound by energy restraints, yet his expression remained unchanged, calm, almost amused. Across from him, Dr. Vareth and High Commander Zalvok observed him like scientists studying an anomaly they couldn't comprehend. This is a waste of time, Zalvok muttered, crossing his arms. He refuses to cooperate. We should extract the information directly. Vareth hesitated. Commander, we've captured another human. Perhaps a test. Zalvok turned sharply. A test? The scientist adjusted his translator device. Humans claim to have no secret weapon, yet their kind defies all logic in battle. Perhaps we force them into a situation where they must reveal how they win. David chuckled, shaking his head. You aliens never learn. Zalvok narrowed his eyes. You seem amused, human. Oh, I am, David said. You think you can figure us out by running some fancy tests. But trust me, you're in for a surprise. Verith ignored the taunt and pressed a command into his holopad. The room's walls shifted, revealing a massive, dome-shaped chamber. A second human, another captured soldier, was dragged in by Gorvok guards, his uniform torn, a gash on his forehead still dripping with blood. Sergeant Ryan Carter, Verith said. A soldier like you. David's smirk faded. Verith gestured to the center of the dome. We will simulate an unwinnable battle. We will place both of you in a combat scenario where surrender is the only logical option. David's jaw clenched. And if we don't? Zalvok's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. Then you die. The floor rumbled as the simulation began. The walls of the chamber transformed into a digital battlefield, a barren wasteland littered with destroyed ships and broken bodies. Thousands of Gorvok soldiers materialized, weapons raised. Overhead, alien warships blocked the sky. A deep robotic voice echoed through the chamber, scenario initiated. Human victory probability, 0%. David and Ryan exchanged glances. No words were needed. They understood each other instantly. Verith watched closely. Now, let's see what makes humans different. The test begins. Blaster fire erupted from all directions. The Gorvok troops moved in waves, an unstoppable force. David ducked behind a simulated wreckage. Ryan, you good? The younger soldier wiped blood from his brow. Peachy. This is a no-win scenario, Ryan muttered. They expect us to surrender. David smirked. Then let's not give them what they want. He peeked over the wreckage, assessing the battlefield. They were outnumbered, outgunned, outmatched. Any other species would have surrendered. But humans? Humans changed the rules. David grabbed a fallen alien weapon, yanking open its power core. Ever made a plasma grenade? Ryan grinned. Just like old times. They worked fast, dismantling enemy weapons, using the wreckage as cover, laying traps in ways the Gorvok AI couldn't predict. The simulation's battle predictor began flashing warnings in Gorvok script. Error, human behavior deviating from expected parameters. Veritha's eyes widened. Impossible. The AI recalculated. Human victory probability had risen to 5%, then 12%, then 28%. Zalvok's claws dug into the console. What is this madness? Verith could barely comprehend what he was witnessing. The humans should have been wiped out. Instead, they were adapting. The unthinkable happens. The battle raged. David and Ryan moved like ghosts across the battlefield, exploiting weaknesses that shouldn't exist. They turned wreckage into barricades. Used the Gorvok's own discarded weapons. Ambushed patrols with makeshift explosives. Within minutes, enemy forces were in disarray. Verith watched in stunned silence as the impossible happened. The Gorvok army, the same force designed to be unstoppable, was crumbling. Zalvok's fists clenched. Enough. He pressed a command. The battlefield froze, the simulation abruptly halting. David and Ryan stood in the center, weapons raised, hearts pounding. A metallic voice announced, "Scenario complete. Human victory probability, 68%. David exhaled. Not bad. Ryan grinned. Could have done better. Zalvok slammed his fist against the console. This is not possible. David looked up at the observation deck, his voice dripping with amusement. You wanted to know how we win? He gestured at the battlefield. This is how. Verith shook his head, unable to deny the truth anymore. They They don't fight like other species. They don't surrender when logic dictates they should. David's eyes met Veritha's. That's your problem, document. You think war is a game of numbers. But we know something you don't. Verith swallowed. What? David smirked. It's not about survival. It's about fighting for something bigger than yourself. The words lingered in the air, and for the first time, Verith felt something strange. Not confusion. Not anger. Fear. Dr. Verith couldn't sleep. For the first time in his long career, his mind refused to rest. He had spent years studying war, dissecting strategies, analyzing battle tactics. The Gorvok Dominion had conquered thousands of species, each falling predictably when overwhelmed. But not humans. They adapted. They thrived in chaos. They fought not for survival, but for something more. And that was the part Verith couldn't explain. He stood in front of his research terminal, watching the replay of the failed simulation. 2 humans. 2 soldiers. They should have lost. Instead, they rewrote the battlefield. Behind him, High Commander Zalvok entered, his heavy footsteps echoing in the sterile lab. Have you found their secret? Zalvok demanded. Verith exhaled. It's not technology. It's not a genetic trait. It's something, intangible. Zalvok growled. Unacceptable. There must be something we can take from them. Verith hesitated. Then, an idea formed. There is one way, he said slowly. We test their strength against their own. Zalvok's mandibles clicked in interest. Explain. Verith turned to the commander. We pit human against human. If their strength is unity, then we must force them to betray each other. A cruel smile spread across Zalvok's face. Now that is an experiment worth running. A choice that shouldn't exist. David Holt and Ryan Carter were dragged from their cells into a new chamber, smaller, darker, its walls covered in shifting holograms. A battlefield was projected around them, but this time, the enemy wasn't Gorvok soldiers. It was humans. David's heart pounded. Captured Earth soldiers, weary and wounded, stood on the other side. A mechanical voice echoed. Victory condition, only one group may leave alive. David's fists clenched. This wasn't a test of survival. This was a test of humanity itself. Veritha's voice came through the speakers. Surrender is not an option. Fight, or die. David glanced at Ryan. The younger soldier's face was pale. They're trying to break us, Ryan murmured. David exhaled. Yeah. And they think we'll fall for it. Breaking the algorithm. From the observation deck, Verith and Zalvok watched closely. The Gorvok commander leaned forward. They will turn on each other. Verith wasn't so sure. On the battlefield, David did the unthinkable. He lowered his weapon. The other human soldiers did the same. Zalvok's mandibles flared. What are they doing? Veritha's eyes widened as he realized, they were refusing to play by the rules. The humans should have fought. Instead, they were communicating, strategizing, uniting. The battle predictor AI flashed warnings. Error. Error. Human tactical response undefined. David shouted across the battlefield, his voice carrying through the simulation. We don't fight for survival. We fight for each other. Ryan nodded. And if we all die? Then at least we don't become what they want us to be. The human soldiers stood together. Zalvok slammed his fists into the console. Destroy them. Wipe them out. The AI refused the command. Verith gasped as the system overloaded. The Gorvok designed the scenario to test for submission, but they had never programmed an option for defiance. The simulation collapsed. Lights flickered. The holograms glitched. And the humans? They stood victorious without firing a single shot. The truth they feared. Alarms blared as the simulation shut down. Guards rushed in to restrain the humans, but David and Ryan stood tall, their eyes locked on the observation deck. Vareth felt a deep chill run down his spine. They knew they were going to die, he murmured. But they refused to become what we wanted them to be. Zalvok's voice was low, dangerous. That means they cannot be controlled. Vareth nodded. Yes. And that means we cannot win. For the first time in Gorvok history, their empire had encountered an enemy they couldn't defeat, not because of weapons or tactics, but because of something far worse. An idea. Zalvok's eyes burned with rage. Then we burn them all. David's voice carried through the speakers, interrupting him. That's why you'll lose. No matter how strong you think you are, we'll always find a way. Vareth clenched his jaw. For the first time in his life, he believed the human. High Commander Zalvok stormed down the dimly lit corridors of the Gorvok warship, his heavy steps echoing through the steel-plated floors. His patience had run out. These humans were not just a nuisance anymore, they were a threat. Dr. Vareth hurried behind him, struggling to match his pace. Commander, we need to reconsider our approach, he urged. We cannot simply. Zalvok whirled around, his mandibles flaring in rage. They refuse to break. They refuse to submit. That means we wipe them out. Vareth hesitated. The scientist was no warrior, but even he understood what Zalvok failed to grasp. The humans had proven something terrifying, they didn't just survive war. They thrived in it. Zalvok turned to his officers. Prepare for a full planetary invasion. Earth burns tonight. Earth's last stand. The human prisoners, David Holt, Ryan Carter, and the other captured soldiers, stood in the holding cell, watching the broadcast from the warship's control center. They saw everything. David clenched his fists as the Gorvok fleet moved into formation. Thousands of warships, descending toward Earth. Ryan exhaled sharply. They're going all in. David nodded. Yeah. And that's their first mistake. The Gorvok believed that overwhelming force was enough. That humans would break when pushed to their limit. But what the aliens didn't understand was that humans never fought alone. David turned to the others. We're getting out of here. A soldier scoffed. In case you forgot, we're locked up on an enemy warship in deep space. David grinned. Yeah. And? Ryan smirked. We've fought from worse odds. The breakout. The guards made their rounds like clockwork. The humans had studied their patterns. When the moment came, David struck first. A single stolen energy blade. A swift strike to the guard's armor joint. The alien crumpled before he could react. Ryan grabbed the fallen weapon. Let's cause some problems. The prisoners overwhelmed the guards, taking their weapons and armor. Within minutes, they had control of the security wing. The alarms blared. The Gorvok were coming. David led them through the corridors, moving fast. They weren't trying to escape. They were trying to take the ship. The unthinkable happens. In the command center, Zalvok's rage grew as Earth's defense forces refused to fall. Impossible, he muttered, watching the screens. Human forces weren't fighting defensively. They were advancing. Civilians, soldiers, engineers, everyone was resisting. The Gorvok invasion was turning into a disaster. Then the alarms inside the warship flared. Zalvok turned sharply. What now? A panicked officer shouted, the humans have taken the lower decks. They're seizing control of the ship. Zalvok's eyes widened in pure rage. No. Send every available warrior to stop them. But it was too late. David and his team reached the bridge. A final battle erupted in the command center, blades, plasma fire, and sheer human determination against elite Gorvok warriors. Zalvok fought like a demon, cutting down soldiers, roaring in fury. But then, he heard the sound that made his blood run cold. A human voice over the ship's comm system. David's voice. Attention, Gorvok fleet. This is Captain David Holt, and we just stole your flagship. Zalvok turned, eyes wide, as David stood over the fallen bodies of his officers, smirking. The humans had taken the warship. Ryan sat at the controls, tapping buttons. "Hey, Commander," he said, grinning. "Ever wonder what happens when your shields drop in the middle of a battle?" Zalvok lunged, roaring in fury. Boom! The flagship's shields collapsed. Every human ship on the battlefield turned their weapons directly toward the now vulnerable Gorvok fleet. For the first time in his life, Zalvok felt fear. Their invincible flagship, their command center, their most powerful warship, was now under human control. And the shields were down. On the bridge, Captain David Holt stood tall, his uniform tattered but his grin wide. He had fought in more battles than he could count, but this was different. This was history in the making. Beside him, Ryan Carter furiously tapped at the ship's controls, rerouting power. Shields are gone. Engines still operational. We can move this thing. David turned to the communication panel. Patch me through. Ryan flipped a switch. A galaxy-wide broadcast went out from the flagship. David leaned forward, speaking with unwavering confidence. To the Gorvok Dominion, this is Captain David Holt, speaking from your flagship. We have taken control. Your shields are down. Your forces are vulnerable. Stand down now, or be wiped out. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the reality of the situation. The Gorvok's breaking point. High Commander Zalvok stumbled to his feet, still reeling from the brutal battle that had unfolded moments before. His personal guards lay dead around him, slain by a handful of human prisoners. He had underestimated them. Again. A Gorvok officer turned to him, eyes wide with desperation. "Commander, what do we do?" Zalvok clenched his fists. Surrender was not an option. His kind did not surrender. But then. The human fleet opened fire. Explosions rocked the Gorvok ships, tearing through hulls like paper. Without their flagship's shields, they were exposed, vulnerable. Zalvok's officers turned to him, fear in their expressions. For the first time in history, it was the Gorvok who were afraid. The final gamble. On the bridge, David knew this wasn't over. "They won't go down easy," he muttered. "They'll make a move." Ryan glanced at the ship's readings. "I don't think they can." Then, the Gorvok fleet made their choice. Zalvok's voice roared over the comms, desperate and furious. "If we cannot have victory, then we take everything with us." David's eyes narrowed. No. The Gorvok ships began to overload their reactors, a last-ditch attempt to take out everything. "They're self-destructing," Ryan shouted. "They'll take Earth with them." David gritted his teeth. "Not if we stop them first." He turned to the stolen flagship's controls. The ship's weapon systems were still online. And he had one shot. "Target their core ships," David commanded. "Take them out before they detonate." Ryan nodded. On it. The battle wasn't about survival anymore. It was about saving Earth. The last strike. The human-controlled flagship turned its cannons toward the Gorvok fleet. Massive energy blasts erupted, tearing through enemy ships before they could overload. One by one, the Gorvok vessels fell. The ones that managed to detonate did so far from Earth, their explosions lighting up the sky like dying stars. David let out a slow breath. They had done it. The Gorvok fleet was gone. Earth was safe. And the greatest war the galaxy had ever seen was over. The truth they couldn't steal. In the aftermath, the surviving Gorvok were rounded up, their weapons confiscated. Zalvok, defeated and restrained, was brought before David. The once mighty commander stared at the human, his eyes filled with something he had never felt before. Not hatred. Not rage. Respect. David crouched down to meet his gaze. You wanted to know how we win? Zalvok remained silent. David continued, voice calm but firm. It was never about weapons. Never about strength. It's about something you could never take from us. Zalvok's voice was hoarse. What? David smiled. Hope. The Gorvok had believed war was won with numbers, power, brute force. But humans? Humans fought for each other. And that was a weapon no enemy could ever steal. The battle was over. The Gorvok fleet lay in ruins, shattered debris drifting silently through space. The human-controlled flagship hovered above Earth, its weapons powered down. The war, the one the Gorvok believed they would easily win, had ended in humiliating defeat. On the surface below, people stared up at the sky, their breath held in collective anticipation. The world had come so close to destruction. Yet, against impossible odds, humanity had prevailed. Again. Inside the flagship's command deck, Captain David Holt stood before the fallen High Commander Zalvok, who sat in restraints, his once fearsome presence now a shadow of itself. Go ahead, Zalvok muttered, his voice laced with bitterness. Execute me. It is what victors do. David stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. Not today. Zalvok's mandibles twitched in confusion. What? David leaned forward. That's the difference between us. You fight to conquer. You fight to destroy. But we fight for something bigger. He straightened, voice firm. And that's why we win. The Gorvok commander scoffed. A meaningless philosophy. War is about power. David folded his arms. Is it? He gestured to the battlefield outside the view screen. Look out there. Your fleet had the best weapons, the best strategy, the best warriors, but it didn't matter. You lost. Zalvok's fists clenched. Because you humans are irrational. You fight even when you should surrender. You turn defeat into victory by means that cannot be quantified. David nodded. Exactly. Zalvok's expression darkened. It defies logic. David smirked. Welcome to humanity. The unbreakable spirit. In the aftermath of the battle, the Gorvok prisoners were gathered, awaiting trial. Many of them, like Zalvok, sat in silent disbelief. The empire they thought was unstoppable had crumbled at the hands of an enemy they had mocked. Dr. Verith, the Gorvok scientist, stood beside David as they overlooked the war-torn battlefield. The scientist's mind was still struggling to process what had happened. Your people should not have survived, Verith admitted. Our calculations, our models, they all pointed to your extinction. David exhaled. Yeah. That's what everyone thinks. Right up until we win. Veritha's gaze was distant. I see now, it was never about weapons or tactics. It was never about physical strength or intelligence. David turned to him. Then what was it about? Verith met his gaze. You humans have something no empire can measure, or steal. He paused, voice almost reverent. You have purpose. David nodded. You fight for something beyond yourself, Verith continued. Not for dominance, but for each other. For hope. For a world worth living in. David clapped him on the shoulder. Took you long enough to figure that out. Vareth chuckled softly, though his eyes remained troubled. And that, I believe, is why you cannot be defeated. A different kind of victory. Zalvok and his remaining soldiers expected execution. That was how the Gorvok did things. In their empire, to lose meant death, a fate they had dealt to thousands of conquered worlds. But the humans did something the Gorvok never could have anticipated. They offered mercy. The captured soldiers were not slaughtered but instead given a choice: stand trial as war criminals, or renounce the Gorvok way and seek peace. Some spat at the offer. Others, like Vareth, hesitated. Zalvok, once a proud warrior, felt his body tremble as he watched the humans choose understanding over annihilation. They, spare us, he whispered, stunned. Vareth nodded. Because they are stronger than us. Zalvok turned away, the weight of defeat crushing him. Not just the loss of a war. The loss of everything he had believed in. The final lesson. A month later, Earth and the remnants of the Gorvok forces met for negotiations. For the first time in history, the Gorvok were not conquerors. They were students. As David stood before the assembled council, a reporter asked him, "Captain Holt, what was humanity's greatest weapon in this war?" David thought for a moment before answering. It wasn't our guns. It wasn't our ships. It wasn't even our strategy. He looked at the gathered crowd, his voice carrying weight. It was our will to fight for something greater than ourselves. It was hope. The room was silent. Then, applause. The story of humanity's unbreakable spirit spread through the galaxy, changing history forever. Epilogue: A Changed Universe. Decades later, the Gorvok Dominion no longer existed. It had become something else. A society that no longer ruled through fear, but through strength of unity. And it all began with a single defeat, one that taught them what true power really was. The power of purpose. The power of hope. The power of humanity.